Well, Mr. Wisch, welcome very much to the Wharton India Economic Forum.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to host you here. And so would love to ask you a few questions about your own background and the kinds of things you've been doing.
Sure.
Why don't we start with you telling us why you started focusing on India?
Well, I was at Goldman Sachs for many years, most of my career at Goldman Sachs. 1994, I moved to Asia, ex-Japan, and I covered the whole region, India, China, and everything in between. India in those days was a very tough place to do business in. In fact, I would say it was probably the toughest country in the entire region. That being said, one thing I noted was the entrepreneurs there were the best, I felt, in all of Asia. So I was impressed by that. And in the back of my mind, I said India would be a great place to invest at some point. I wasn't sure if it was going to be in my lifetime, but I knew it had potential. After I left Goldman Sachs, I did some work in the not-for-profit sector. A colleague of mine suggested I go back to India in early, about 2002, 2003. I went back and I saw some very significant changes taking place, and I reached the conclusion that India would have enormous opportunity, not just for the next couple of years, but for really the next decades and century. And I think India has been a sleeping giant, not just for decades, but I think for centuries, with slow or little growth. And I think that was unleashed in the early 90s and really came to fore after 2000. And I saw that. Had I not spent so much time in India in the 90s, I wouldn't have noticed it coming back. In fact, I would have probably gotten off the plane and said, let me get back on and go back to New York. But I think India's got great promise, great challenges, but I recognize that and I wanted to invest, and hence that's how I got involved in India.
And so then you started India Equity Partners.
Yeah, I actually began with IREO, which is our real estate business, and saw a tremendous opportunity in real estate. No foreigners were doing real estate in India. It was mostly, there was no institutional capital, mostly family-run businesses, but I went and met with a lot of developers, and the returns that they were getting were just tremendous. I met my partner, Anurag Bhargava, who was trying to raise about $25 million to do real estate in India. And I spent about 6 months with him and his team. And after 6 months, I agreed to invest with him. He asked me if I would be an advisor and part owner and help him raise the first fund. $1.6 billion of equity later, we're full partners. And we now have about 14 projects in India. We're a fully integrated development and operating company. I also then, a few years after that, started IEP, India Equity Partners, which is our private equity business.
So if I can just ask you to stay on the IREO part for a quick second, and we'll come to India Equity Partners in a bit. So real estate in India is not an easy industry to be in.
Correct.
Neither is private equity, but I would say that real estate is probably even harder to be in, especially as someone who's not from India. Can you tell us about your experiences in the real estate industry, what challenges you've seen?
Sure. Well, first of all, we're very local. I think we bring the best of the West and India. We've got about 450 to 500 people in 8 offices, but we're very local. But we also bring a sense of Western fiduciary responsibility and ethics. So I think we're unique. But we have to have people on the ground. And what we decided to do initially, we did not want to allocate our capital to local developers and be at the whim and mercy of local developers who, frankly, I don't think oftentimes are easy to trust. So we wanted to be in control of our own processes, and really from the beginning, as I said, aggregating land, getting the approvals, doing the design, planning, construction, marketing, and selling. So it has been challenging. I think the biggest challenge is the time it takes to get things done in India. It's frustrating, but there's a tremendous current at our back, and there's a tremendous movement of people into cities and wealth, the rise of a middle class. Everyone wants to own real estate. So we're very focused on residential, to some extent hospitality and commercial as well. But I see great promise, and it's going to take longer than expected, but with patience should do very well.
So to draw upon the point that you just made, you're trying to combine, obviously local expertise with, as you said, Western fiduciary responsibility. Now, as we think about India from a management perspective, obviously there are a lot of local challenges, and there are lots of things that India and managers in India can learn from management practices outside. So you started to touch upon that. We'd love to get your perspective on how you've managed to do that. Was there some resistance from local managers when you tried to introduce some of these, quote-unquote Western practices, right? I understand they were probably familiar, but I would love to understand the dynamic there.
Well, I think that there always are challenges. I think one of the big issues I see with India, most promoters, entrepreneurs, think that execution is easy, and don't worry, it will get done. But it's got more challenges than you think, and I think putting systems in place and processes and procedures is something that is not typical. Most people in India like to do things by the seat of their pants, but becoming professional and develop. And by the way, real estate is a challenging business anywhere in the world, including in the United States.
Right.
And many real estate companies are not well or professionally managed even in the United States or in the West. So I think that the bar is very low in India, but I think our standards, not just of how we operate, but also the projects, the quality of what we do is quite high, and I think the market is recognizing that.
Sure. So switching to India Equity Partners,
Sure.
why don't you tell us a little bit more about what your focus is, how your experience has been in the private equity industry,
Sure.
and what lessons you've brought in from the PE industry in the U.S.?
We are quite unique in private equity in that we focus exclusively on significant minority and majority stakes in businesses. Most of Indian private equity, it's a growth equity market, but most are minority stakes and a lot of pipes.
Right.
We did some of those early on, and we came to the conclusion very early that if you want to invest in small minority stakes or pipes, you might as well just invest in the public markets. We think that the real value is finding the promoters who not just want your money, but also want us for the value that we bring. And we have a very value-added team where we help companies with their processes and procedures internally, with strategy, with acquisitions, with new customers, financing. And one thing that's another unique thing about us is we have a group of platform CEOs is what we call them. And these are former CEOs of successful businesses in India. We bring them on board full-time to help us find new acquisitions, and we work with them to find the acquisitions and then manage them. So we will do majority stakes, and when we do minority stakes, they're significant minority stakes where we have a board seat and we're very much involved in the management of the business.
Right. And so as you've dealt with the private equity industry in India with a lot of business owners and on the real estate side, can you share your perspective on what you see as some of the unique management practices or unique lessons that the rest of the world can learn from the way Indian managers run their businesses?
Well, I think that one of the things that I was struck by in the 90s and which brought me to India and continues to be the main reason is I think the entrepreneurial talent in India is extraordinary. I think that you'll see some of the absolute best managers in the world, very focused on costs. And India was starved of capital for decades, and I think managers got by with very little capital. So I think the focus on costs and is very important. And I think that managers are very hardworking. On the other hand, I think that many of the managers haven't branched out and brought a big team in with breadth and depth of management talent. And many companies are very hierarchical. The promoter walks in, everyone stands up. I think that's changing. Will change slowly. But I think that Indian companies have a lot to offer the world. And what is also striking is Indian companies are not just successful in India, but unlike China, you see many companies that have expanded globally.
Launching abroad, yeah. And do you see that trend continuing and them seeing sort of bringing that same cost focus to their operations abroad as well? Or do you see them adapting more to the kinds of circumstances they might face in different countries?
Well, I think that you'll get the best of both. I think that there's a lot that can be brought into India. As I said, management and processes and procedures are very important. But the entrepreneurial spirit, that work ethic that India brings, I think will help these companies globally as well. And we see that already in the technology sector and in many aspects of global companies already with Indian talent. So I think that the best of those two cultures, if you will come together, and Indian companies will have a real influence on the world going forward.
Yeah. Well, great. Steve, it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.